Thank you. Ken, thank you very much for coming down from Walpole, New Hampshire. And you live there because that's quieter than New York City to do films?
When I finished shooting most of my film, Brooklyn Bridge, my first film for PBS, I was completely broke and I knew I had to get a real job. And the rent on my 5th floor walk-up in Chelsea was going from $275 a month to $325 a month. So I went to some place where I could live for nothing, and the film turned out okay, and I decided to stay.
Okay, well, it worked out for everybody, including the country, and I want to thank you for coming to 92nd Street Y, and I noticed that you have a pin on. What is that pin?
Oh, this is my friend Robert Kraft, who is the owner of the New England Patriots and Kraft Industries, has been shocked in recent months and years about the rise in anti-Semitism, and he started invested a great deal of his own funds into a committee to combat anti-Semitism. And the blue square represents, there's a little tiny square within it. Jews, as everyone knows, make up about 2.4% of the American population. And I wish I could tell you the statistic wasn't rising of the number of hate crimes. It's well over a majority of all hate crimes in the United States.
All right, well, thank you for wearing that. You don't have to be Jewish to worry about anti-Semitism, but if you go back, is there any Burns Jewish lineage?
Well, no, not that I know of, but I've been married to 2 Jewish women, so all my 4 daughters are Jewish by Jewish law, therefore.
Okay.
And so I've been told by people that I'm an honorary Jew. Okay. And because I worry about a lot of things, including anti-Semitism, apparently it makes me a little bit of a member.
So for those who don't know you, as well as I have come to know you over the years, how did you get into this? Most people that go to college want to go into something important like private equity or hedge funds, something that can make the world a better place.
Right.
How did you get off the track, and how did you not get into that world?
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Well, first of all, I made the decision. I was living in Ann Arbor. My father taught at the University of Michigan. I assumed I'd go there, which might have put me on the straight and narrow and avoid the kind of mistakes that I've clearly made, and not gone into private equity. But I went to Hampshire College, which was in 1970 when it opened a new experimental school. I came in the fall of 71, and it's essentially just the elevator pitch is, graduate school at an undergraduate level. You design your own your curriculum. You assemble faculty members to judge your own self-designed examinations. It's a lot harder than it sounds. And so I've wanted to be a filmmaker since I was 12. My mom had cancer. I watched my dad after she died cry. I'd never seen him cry before. It was at an old movie. And I realized that's what I want to do. It had provided him some safe haven. And so I just sort of tilted towards that. That meant that I was going to be John Ford or Alfred Hitchcock. Today you'd say Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg. But when I went to Hampshire, all my teachers were social documentary still photographers, particularly Jerome Liebling, a Brooklyn-born still photographer, wonderful mentor. And they reminded me that there is as much drama in what is and what was as anything of the human imagination. So my molecules got rearranged, and I ended up, by 18 years old, wanting to be documentary, and somehow this completely untutored and untrained interest in American history, which I've had for as long as I can remember, sort of clicked with that. The first opportunity I had to make a film at the end, sort of the senior thesis, if you will. Hampshire doesn't have seniors, but Division 3, it was called, was to make a film for Old Sturbridge Village. And the last shot of that is a pan across a painting. And the rest literally has been history.
So for many people who've seen you on television or seen you other places, you used to have what I'll call a Prince Valiant haircut.
Right.
And I noticed recently that it's not quite as Prince Valiant as it used to be. Did your barber retire? Or?
So there's a lot of converging things that have happened, and it's been an important question, and it's really important, I think, for the audience to know that you and I have been in conversation many times, maybe a dozen times over the last 10 years, and quite often you end our conversations by asking about the haircut. Meanwhile, there was an intervention that Tom Brokaw tried to take place 10 years ago when I turned 60. He said, it's time for a big boy haircut. And I completely ignored him until, and through COVID, and then two things happened. One, I noticed that his hair was getting wilder and kind of crazier and Einsteinian in a way as he got older. And then two, COVID happened and my hair just became, I had been a long-haired hippie in high school and college. And I just decided that maybe it was time to get a big boy haircut. So
okay, you went into
I'm a
document.
little bit embarrassed about it.
Well, it looks good.
Okay.
What happened to the barber, though? I thought the barber did
So I
retire.
went to the same person for a long time, but COVID sort of changed the dynamics of that. So anyway,
So, all right, so you go into filmmaking, and you make, we'll talk about the first one that was of significance was Brooklyn Bridge. Right?
Yeah.
How did you pick that topic? It doesn't jump off the page as a topic of great excitement, the Brooklyn Bridge. Why did you pick that topic?
Because it is so exciting. My best friend was a book sort of salesman in New England, and he worked for a number of publishers, and he came in and threw down on my bed a paperback trade edition of David McCullough's, published a few years before, Great Bridge, the epic story of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And he said, this is something you'd like. And I remember being insulted because he and I, we were reading, novels, Dostoevsky and Borges and Tolstoy and, Faulkner. And he was saying nonfiction. And I digested it and told my partners, this is our next film. And I would take this hour film and half of it would be what David had done, the story of the construction, which is epic. And then the second half would be a sort of a look at it as this symbol of strength, vitality, ingenuity, and promise, and deal with, as you're doing, a lot of these iconic images about the bridge. And the thing that I liked was this idea that I could not just have a third-person narrator, but a chorus of first-person voices that would read off camera. And I was able to snare Julie Harris that then helped us grab lots of people to read. I could make the story come alive, not just with a single, as we call it, voice of God, third-person narrator.
So you won some awards for that, and then eventually you came up with the idea of doing, I guess it was a 10-part series on the... Nine-part series on the Civil War.
Yeah.
Was it easy to convince sponsors that this...
No, so the best story I have about sponsors, and first of all, other full disclosure, David has been a generous supporter of my work and several other things that we do, including Unum, which curates sort of in small, manageable bites that people in private equity can digest, our big epic series.
It's got to be very simple, right?
Yeah. The Civil War had been the determining fact of all the first 5 films that I've made. The Civil War, the Brooklyn Bridge wouldn't have been built without this new metal steel that the war helped to promote. The Shakers, had been thriving and declined precipitously in a country in which the sole survival after you'd murdered, now we think, 750,000 of our own people, didn't seem. The Congress's most important moment was when there were 2 Congresses. Huey Long, another film that I did, came from a dirt-poor North Louisiana parish that refused to secede from the Union. They thought the Confederacy, correctly, was a rich man's cause, and it became a kind of hotbed of radicalism and populism that spawned him. So all of these things were pointing, and I did do a film on the Statue of Liberty, and as your little teaser is correct, this was originally intended as a gift to Mrs. Lincoln to celebrate the survival of the Union and the abolition of slavery despite her husband's ultimate sacrifice. And it's only, as you know, a complicated set of things that changes the dynamic to what we think it is. And in fact, we used the Statue of Liberty, and each of the 3 episodes of our film, The U.S. and the Holocaust, last year, had an Emma Lazarus phrase from it, and the Statue of Liberty was the sort of MacGuffin, Alfred Hitchcock would call it, the symbol throughout the whole thing of the story that we were telling.
So where did you, how much did it cost to do the Civil War series?
It was about $3.5 million, which seemed to me like this Vietnam cost $30 million, just to give you a thing. And it needed it. It had 126 music cuts, including 7 by the Beatles. But raising the money, most of it came from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. A couple foundation came in. And we got the first corporate money that we'd received from General Motors. And I slid the NEH proposal to them that was like 2 inches thick. And the guy, after lunch, the GM guy in Detroit just says, "What's it about?" And so I was prepared. I had a smaller proposal, 25 pages, and he looks at it, he flips, he says, "What's it about?" And so I said, before the war, in speaking about our country, we said the United States are, plural, grammatically correct. After the war, we started saying the United States is, which is ungrammatical. The Civil War took us from a collection of states to a one thing, a nation, and I want to describe how that are became an is. He said, "How much do you need?"
Were you shocked at how it became such a cultural phenomenon?
Totally flabbergasted. Totally. I mean, I thought I'd made a good film. I just had fingers to the bone for years, and when I went to the press tour in the summer of '90, it was going to be broadcast in late September, all the critics said, "Oh, this is terrific, but no one's going to watch it. Everybody's attention span is so low, and they watch MTV videos." And anyway, Stephen Bochco has this new police procedural in which they sing called Cop Rocks. Nobody's going to watch it.
So you used a lot of lyrical music. Where did you come up with the idea of having that kind of music, and what was the most famous piece of music?
So all the art forms, my brother also does documentary films, and he said something to me once a few years ago that all the other art forms, when they die and go to heaven, want to be music. It's the only art that's invisible. All the others are there. And so we use in the editing room the language of music. And so music is always important. And in filmmaking, it's kind of got things backwards. They do the music at the end.
Right.
You score it, which is a mathematical term, to increase emotions you hope are already there, rather than baking it in. So I've always, from the very beginning, recorded the music early. I discovered a tune by one of my session musicians on earlier films named Jay Unger, a Jewish kid from the Bronx, who wrote the most beautiful Scotch-Irish lament in 1983 called Ashokan Farewell. He ran and still runs a music school up near the Ashokan Reservoir, near West Hurley, New York, in the foothills of the Catskills. And it was breaking up one summer, and he sat down and wrote this lament, and it's called Ashokan Farewell. It's been played 1,000 times today, David, at weddings and funerals and memorial services, and all the other pieces of music are from the Civil War, either hymns that people sang or popular music of the time, mostly the martial music that was beloved by people on both sides.
So in doing research, you uncovered a letter from, was it Captain Ballou?
Sullivan Ballou, yeah.
Yes. And that letter very graphically described the prospect of death and how he was writing to his wife. Was it wife?
Yes.
And it kind of symbolized the death and the commitment people had to the cause we're fighting for, but also they recognized they were likely to lose their life. And was that one of the more emotional pieces of the whole?
Yeah, I had been begging. We had about 23 scholars who were advising us, and with the exception of a couple, particularly Barbara Fields, who's still at Columbia, people weren't sending us the first-person stuff we wanted. And finally, from a guy named Don Fehrenbacher, who is a historian of the causes and of Lincoln from Illinois, University of Illinois, I believe, sent this letter, which I read out loud, and we were all in tears. And I said, they said, "Should we put it in the middle of at the end of the Battle of Manassas?" I said, "No, at the end of the first episode. Manassas happens earlier in that episode to show what the scale of," because this is a letter about love. It's about love of country. It's about love of government. It's about love of cause. It's about love of family. It's about love of children. It's about love of wife and lover. And it's at all these levels. And he's expressing to his wife the fact that if he dies, he will always be there for her. And he does die a week later during the first Battle of Bull Run. And it's just, it's so spectacularly beautiful. I've never come across anything remotely close to it.
So normally when people are very successful in something like television, they head out to Hollywood to cash in. So after the Civil War, did you go out to meet with Steven Spielberg to ask how you could make commercial films and make a lot of money for yourself?
You know, they all invited me out there, and I realized that there was a funny, they call it the industry, which ought to be a little bit of a warning. They don't call it the art form, they call it the industry. And so I noticed this industrial component to it, so I just stayed in Walpole. And what I'm very happy to say is that I have been able, for the next 40 films, or maybe since the Civil War, not that many, but I've been able to say, you know, whether they're a single episode, a single 1 hour or whatever, or a 10-part series on Vietnam that's 18 hours, to say to you that if you don't like something, it's all my fault. I mean, I've been able to release a director's cut, and that's not true, with the exception of a few people. And so I'd also like to suggest that you measure your bottom line in many different kinds of ways. Right. And the beauty of where I get to live, the isolation, it's labor intensive what we do, so still keeping a low overhead is important to funding it and stuff. I've done all right.
But for 50 years, you've been making films, and you always have to go raise the money for it, and you're never getting rich from it because these are PBS, public broadcasting kinds of things. So your children ever said to your dad, you know, maybe you could make a few that make some money for us?
So one of my daughters has gone out and has made a bundle and done good things in you would say Hollywood. She stayed in Brooklyn, but I've done okay. It's okay. You know, I've been able to put my kids through school, so that's all that really matters. And
so happiness.
I don't have a mortgage, so.
Okay, so you're happy.
Yeah. Oh, I'm very, very happy. And one of the things is that I like also the aspect of it, of raising the money, of refining the ability to talk about something. And I'm interested too in you and why you have been so central in our country as the head of the Smithsonian, the chairman of the board of the Smithsonian Institution, of supporting projects, the repair of the Washington Monument, supporting my films, many other aspects of museums in a very mostly quiet way. And then you have your other life interviewing people, but you needed to do this. I want to know about why you needed to do this.
Well, I guess I was a Ken Burns wannabe. I don't know, but I guess I have bought a few iconic symbols of our country, Declaration of Independence and so forth, and I live in Washington. I've supported them, so I thought this would be an interesting thing to do, but then I realized this is not as easy as I thought. I mean, it takes a lot of time and so forth, but let's talk about one we have a clip for. You did a documentary on the Statue of Liberty, and I did one as well, and the thing that I learned, which you obviously already knew, the Statue of Liberty had nothing to do with immigration. None. It was basically, that was an afterthought. It was really about thanking the United States for freeing the slaves, more or less, and plus having a nice Franco-American relationship. So,
and I think it also had a political use in France, which is they're worried about authoritarian rule. Right. And they think if they celebrate liberty, they are in some ways helping to protect their own internal flank. The Brits had this incredibly snarky comment. He says, "It is sad to think that this liberty should be sent to America, which has too much, from France, which has so little." You know, so there's all sorts of undertones. And our film on the statue was divided in half, and at the end of the celebration that opened it on October 28th, 1883, and Grover Cleveland's there, and they get the stuff all mixed up, and they have the ceremony. No one in all the speeches said a word about welcoming immigrants.
So Grover Cleveland was there as the president of the United States, but had he not previously either vetoed letting that land be used?
The Americans lifted less than a finger to help. The government lifted. So it was this incredible grassroots thing. You have to remember, as you probably know, that the pedestal of the statue is almost as tall as the statue itself. And the Richard Morris Hunt, I think, was the architect of that. And it ended up being school kids that Joseph Pulitzer in the New York World used to appeal to it. And they buried in the foundation of it all of the names of the Masons, Freemasons in New York and New Jersey who had worked on this thing.
The statue was paid for by the French, more or less, And the pedestal was paid for more or less by the Americans, so it took a long time to raise the money.
Our film was a celebration of it. The first half was how it was built, like the Brooklyn Bridge, and the second half was trying to deal with it as an iconic symbol. And it was interesting for us is that the people that we ended up talking to, when we spoke to Americans who'd been here for many generations, I'd ask them, what is liberty? And they kind of go, well, freedom. And so we ended up populating the film with people like Mario Cuomo, who was the new governor of New York State. We did Jerzy Kaczynski, Milos Forman, Barbara Jordan, other people who actually were at the nub, as Lonnie's implying in his last of this, including James Baldwin, who was then a scholar at my then alma mater, Hampshire College. And so he's throughout the film, but there was if there was one thing that held the film down, gave it real ballast, was his comment, because it was opposite of all the other things that people were saying. And so it actually reminded you that she faces one direction.
So for people who don't know James Baldwin, basically who was he and why was he a prominent person in the 1960s in the United States?
James Baldwin is one of our great literary figures, an African-American man, a black man, a gay man, and who wrote spectacular novels and essays, and like so many people of that time, challenged almost everything of the conventional wisdom. I think the histories that you and I are struggling with, of the way in which you don't want to puncture an icon. It was not my intention to do that with any of them. But you want to let in a much more complicated history. Almost everything we talk about, particularly with our iconic figures, are superficial. They're filled with conventional wisdom, and they don't acknowledge or tolerate or even celebrate the complexity that underlies them, which I think makes, and I know you do, makes much more interesting stories. So we have this very short clip from my film with James Baldwin, who's struggling even in the interview, which was interesting. He's in 4 or 5 times, and this is one of the latter times that he's in.
Let me ask you about another film that you did, large part series, which is the Vietnam War. And how many parts was that?
10.
Okay, so 10 parts, and in that you kind of uncovered the fact that the United States senior government officials knew the war was not winnable. Is that right?
That's right.
Was that one of the major discoveries of your research?
No, I think we knew that from the release of the Pentagon Papers when Anthony Russo and Daniel Ellsberg took the RAND Corporation study that Robert McNamara had commissioned, and we were able to speak to Robert Gard, a general who was in the office of McNamara, who was in charge of assembling the archive that it eventually got copied surreptitiously and released to various newspapers that proved that we had known from the Truman administration on the unwinnability of this, and that finding out information and that figure, whoever it was, Robert McNamara or the president or lesser officials, generals, would say the exact opposite that day that they learned the contradictory information.
So
I think we were able to, I don't want to take credit for much because I think we're aggregators of that story, and we were able to aggregate all of the recent scholarship about it, and a few things are new.
Right.
We found some tapes that hadn't been heard.
During the Vietnam War, the country was pretty much divided down the middle for a long time. Some people supported the war to end communism, make sure the domino theory didn't come into practice, and other people thought it was a useless exercise of our military power. Today, do you find that there are many Americans who think the war was justified and was worth fighting?
No, I don't find too many. There are some of the soldiers that we interviewed still sort of hold to the idea that they were doing the right thing and sort of feel like they should still have done it, that we shouldn't have abandoned, that the story of the Vietnam is the abandonment of a government that lacked the will. But I think even people who might have supported it back then have come around to the idea that it was useless. But the funny thing is that the whole political divisions that we experience today are amplifications of what took place back there. And I think that what happens is the Vietnam War has, in retrospect, become one of the proxy representations for the divisions. The problem is that it's so bankrupt because it's just completely binary. and nothing's binary. Politics has to put things in a binary context. But what we are trying to prove is how complicated. We interviewed North Vietnamese civilians who sounded a lot like our civilians, and North Vietnamese soldiers who sounded exactly like our Marines and Army guys. And so there was an interesting interplay and dynamic in which we could evolve. I mean, it's so far, maybe the revolution will be, this was the most complex story we've ever had to put together.
So I grew up during the time that President Kennedy was president. I admired him, and I chair the Kennedy Center, so I obviously spent some time around the image of President Kennedy and what he stood for. But is there any evidence, as some of his supporters would say, that had he lived and he won the election in '64, he was then going to pull out of Vietnam?
No, not at all. He inherited, I mean, I do not believe this, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and talking to scholars. He inherited from Eisenhower about 700 advisors when he was assassinated. Which is coming up in just a couple days. He had 17,000 advisors. LBJ, who had fashioned himself as the return of FDR, was all about domestic transformation, of which he did an incredible job and social stuff. And he said to McNamara and Rusk and Bundy and all the others, he said, "I need you more than he needed you." And so I don't think Kennedy would have done anything. I think you would have ended up with what we call boots on the ground, which he had to wait a long time until March of '65, and he'd had his own mandate in the fall election, and which was a landslide victory over Barry Goldwater, before he could do it. And even then, he's confiding to his friend Richard Russell of Georgia that there's no going back. He can't put
one of your documentaries was on America's pastime, baseball. Why did baseball become so popular, and what is it that still has a hold on America?
It's the best game that's ever been invented. I like lots of American sports, but there's nothing better. I mean, it's baseball and every other sport. Now, other things are sports, and baseball has a kind of, it's the only game that's really accompanied most of the decades of our national narrative, and so we can send the sort of echo to it, and it bounces back and tells us who we are. It's the history of presidents and punctuated by wars, which is what most people see as American history. It's also about immigration and assimilation. Each wave of immigrant group that learned the game is exactly the immigrant waves of the United States. It's about popular culture. It's about heroes and villains. It's all sorts of things. And of course, it's about race. When Jack Roosevelt Robinson, the grandson of a slave, made his way to first base in Ebbets Field on April 15th, 1947, it was the first real progress in civil rights since the Civil War. So I said while I was working, people thought I was crazy, this is the sequel to the Civil War series. And look, there's no clock, I don't have to tell you this, there's no clock. It's the only sport in which the defense has the ball. Right? I mean, there are lots of things about it that are so uniquely different, and the complaint about it being boring, as George Will said to me in the series, he says, football has two of the worst American features: violence punctuated by frequent committee meetings.
So, who was the greatest baseball player of all time?
Besides Babe Ruth? He's the most important because of the way he utterly changed the game. My bet is that it's Willie Mays, I would say.
And he is still alive, right?
He is alive, yes. Hank Aaron is not. He'd be my number two, I think. I talked to a lot of ball players and coaches while we were making our update of the series in 2010 called The 10th Inning, in which we were dealing with steroids, and a lot of them thought that Barry Bonds was the greatest player.
So who was the greatest Jewish baseball player?
Well, probably a lot of people would immediately say Hank Greenwood because he played every day except on the high holidays, and he hit home runs. The writer Dan Okrent said in our film every other day, and he's a big slugger. But for my money, it's Sandy Koufax. I mean, I've never seen a dominant pitching like this in my life, except maybe Pedro Martinez from the Dominican Republic.
It's hard to believe, though, when you think back on it. Sandy Koufax retired when he was 29 years old. I mean, just think about it. Today, people are pitching when they're 40 sometimes.
Yeah, no. And, he had done a lot of damage to his arm. I mean, people knew exactly there was no signals, right? They knew they were going to get one of two pitches, and they still couldn't hit it.
You did a documentary on country music.
Yeah.
So New York City may not be the center of country music. I think it's fairly fair to say.
You know, I heard, I was trying to raise money for the Brooklyn Bridge, and I had this office at the Department of Records and Information Services down around City Hall. And I walked out at lunch one day, and there was this voice I had never heard before, this like 1977 or something like that. And I just went, what is that? Who is it? And there were thousands of people in City Hall Park. And I pulled somebody and said, what's that? He goes, are you crazy? That's Dolly Parton. And I just said, and first of all, when I did a gig on country music with Wynton Marsalis at Jazz at Lincoln Center, and I was talking to him, and he says, she's never sung a wrong note in her life. So I think New Yorkers know. Yeah,
the Kennedy Center, we gave her Kennedy Center honors once, and her famous line was, it costs a lot of money to look this cheap.
Yeah, this is what she grew up in this dirt poor East Tennessee County, and she modeled herself on the town tart, whore. And she did her best to try to look that way. She thought that was the epitome of beauty.
But when you got into that, for people in, let's say, Tennessee or other places in the country where it's very popular, is it like a religion almost, country music?
It is, and it's an interesting family. You know, I think as someone born in rock and roll and R&B and knowing some about classical and some about country, I worked in a record store in high school, so I was aware of this stuff. I wanted to do it because there's something elemental. Jazz, I made a film on jazz, and it's the American art form. It's recognized around the world that way. Country music has the same kind of elemental basic unit, the way jazz has blues, not the music blues, but the form of the blues at its heart. And so there's really simple, almost haiku that is able to be communicated. I mean, one of our episodes on Hank Williams was called The Hillbilly Shakespeare, and it's really, really true what he said. I mean, just go home tonight and listen to I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. Or Johnny Cash wrote a beautiful song that he didn't really understand. His daughter did, who sang it, Roseanne, who sang it, who lives in the city, who sang it at his memorial service. And if you Google that YouTube thing, it's called I Still Miss Someone, you will not know, you will understand about country music. And Emmylou Harris said to us that if you really want to know, just get anything by Merle Haggard and put it down on any, she's an old record player person, put it down on any drop and you'll understand exactly what it's about.
So you've also done a documentary on buffaloes.
Yeah.
Now, why is Buffalo, New York called Buffalo, New York?
For that same reason. I mean, early, when Columbus arrived, we think that this animal that had had for 600 generations a relation with native people were from sea to shining sea. There was an ordinance in the early 1700s in Georgia, please don't kill the buffalo on the town common. Ignored. The Jamestown settlers went up the Potomac to what is now Washington, D.C., found a big herd. When Daniel Boone forged the Cumberland Trail, he was not forging a trail, he was following an old buffalo trace. What happened was that by the beginning of the 19th century, commerce and market pressures and Western expansion had just shrunk them to the Great Plains, which was this vast territory that people passed through to find gold in California or land in Oregon or business in, that would be for private equity, in Santa Fe, right? And it was still the province of Native Americans who, having inherited the horse from the Spanish, had transformed their cultures. And the buffalo is at the center of all of their lives, not just material existence, but their spiritual existence. And then in a decade and a half, between 1860, we killed by the tens of millions the buffalo, just took their hides because they ran the belts of the Industrial Revolution, the machines, the leather belts they needed to run the machines of the Industrial Revolution, and left everything, hundreds of pounds of meat, the head, the horns, the hooves, everything, and took away. And it was a twofer, as one Native American woman scholar says in our film, she is a Salish Kootenai, that, you know, you got to run your Industrial Revolution, but you also got to kill the Indian.
You did a documentary on Muhammad Ali. Mm-hmm. What was so distinctive about him, and why would you focus on him?
He's, I would argue, perhaps the greatest athlete of all time. You know, it's apples and oranges in some places. His life is so interesting, and we took a lot of criticism while we were working on it because there are a lot of good documentaries about Muhammad Ali, but we wanted to do soup to nuts. We didn't want to just do one fight, the Thrilla in Manila, or all the George Fraser fights, or his fight with the United States government, which is incredibly principled stand, or his relationship with the Nation of Islam. We wanted to do all of it, from childhood in Louisville, Kentucky, to his death. I mean, there were times when he was the most hated man in America, and when he died, he was the most beloved person on the planet. And I want to find out how that happens. And it's a very interesting, it's very complicated, it's dark at times, story not only of us, but also of him. And I'm as proud of that film. I made it with my oldest daughter, Sarah, and her husband, David McMahon, and it's...
The Parkinson's disease that he suffered from the latter part of his life, inevitably, was that a result of all the boxing?
No one can know for sure, but we presume that the kinds of things that happened, the tremors that started, the Parkinson's that developed, were certainly promoted by the blows that he took.
So you're now working on a documentary on the Revolutionary War. How does that come out?
So, yeah, it's really, well, Benjamin Rush of the time basically says it's still going on, right? We're still, the revolution has to still be going on all the time. And there's, you know, I first after the Civil War said I'm not going to do any more wars. Then I decided to do the Second World War, and before the ink was dry on that, a year before broadcast, I said we're doing Vietnam. And before Vietnam was done, I said we're doing the revolution. There are no photographs, there's no newsreels. It's super hard, and it's really, really complicated. And I can only just describe it as I was talking to a group of funders about it, and I was just being super honest about the stories that we don't tell about it. When we say revolution, we think it's 55 white guys in Philadelphia. Well, that's the Constitutional Convention after the war is over. Or it's sturdy Minutemen. Those Minutemen were totally unreliable when the fighting started, and they went back to do their crops. The Continental Army, the people that won the war, were ne'er-do-wells, not ne'er-do-wells, but sort of ex-cons and teenagers and second and third sons who were not in the line for inheritance. It was recent immigrants, Irish and German. It was runaway blacks and freed blacks. They made up the nucleus of the Continental Army that defeated the greatest military power on earth, with the help of the French, and it's complicated. And there's stories about Native peoples and about black people and about women and their empowerment and Germans and French and all of that. And you have to, I've been working on it all day today, keep all these balls rolling. But it's so interesting because at the end of it, this group of people sort of gulped and kind of were like anxious, I think, of what they were like getting into. And then they said, well, who is emerging, Ken? Somebody got up the nerve, as the most important person. I said, oh, George Washington. You know, and that's true.
If Washington had not been the general, could we have won that war?
No. No, and in fact, we have one historian in the film who breaks the fourth wall, which we rarely do in our films, and says, look, I'm not a great man theory, but I don't see how we survive without George Washington.
So when my son was 8 years old, I took him to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, and we're walking around the backyard of it, the piazza, they call it. And there was a kind of a tree limb down there, and my son said, is that the cherry tree that George Washington chopped down? And I said, I cannot tell a lie, it is. So let's talk about, for a moment, the Holocaust series you did. You did I think it was two-part series. Three-part series on the Holocaust and how it was viewed in the United States and how, relatively speaking, the United States didn't do that much to prevent the Holocaust. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it's called...
We have a clip from that as well.
Yeah, it's called The U.S. and the Holocaust, and essentially what it did is, the first episode is well before, I mean, it really takes us through, you know, the early years and almost omnipresent American xenophobia, American anti-Semitism, American racism. And we pretend as Americans that we went to the movies after the Second World War and shock, horror, we discovered what was happening. There were 3,000 articles in the newspapers in the United States in 1933 alone about the mistreatment of Jews in Germany. And that's the first year, and they haven't yet, by the way, gone to the American South in like 34, 35 to develop these discriminatory laws against Jews, the Nuremberg codes.
Right.
by studying our Jim Crow laws, and they're much more loose than the Jim Crow law that said one drop, this is me quoting their laws, one drop of Negro blood makes you black in America. And they had 5 categories, I think, 2 Jewish, 1 mongrel, 2 mongrels, and 1 Aryan thing. So if you had one grandparent who was a Jew, you could still be a full-fledged Aryan. But in the United States and Mississippi, and when we protested their treatment of Jews in the 30s, they would look at us and go, Mississippi.
Didn't Hitler have one grandparent who was Jewish?
We don't know, but we think so. And it's
so the U.S. government didn't let people trying to escape from Nazi Germany in the United States because we had quotas.
So we passed in 1924 the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which was a reaction to the wave of immigration that began in 1870 and ended after the First World War, that had let in tens of millions of people, including more Jews than anywhere else on the planet, in New York City. And this caused a backlash. And so there were quotas now that favored Northern European Protestant nations. It coincided with this theory of eugenics that postulated completely fraudulently that there could be a hierarchy of races, a hierarchy of ethnicities, and even a hierarchy of nationalities. And so Jews were categorized as uncouth Asiatics. And we didn't want Southern Europeans who were Catholic and swarthy, and Greeks and Italians and things like that, and certainly not Central Europeans who were Catholic or Orthodox, and certainly not the Jews that populated Europe. And so we essentially made a barrier. Let me just first say, the United States let in 225,000 people, more than any other sovereign nation. We let in more people. But if we had followed even the pernicious laws of the Johnson-Reed Act, and we kept changing the goalposts, we could have let in 4 or 5 times more. And I would suggest with a country that was actually more interested in the humanistic issues involved, we could have let in even more than that, maybe double. So then you're subtracting 2 million from 6. And that's a big thing, and that's on us. We did not do that, and I believe we could have done that.
Is there a clip from that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that we could show something. It's a pretty extended clip, not that long, but I just think it's sort of speaking to our common moment, just about the Bible, the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes says, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun."
The theory of history, as was described by a famous Harvard professor, is that those people that don't know their history are condemned to relive it. And so one of the things that Ken has tried to do is to educate people in ways that will help them recognize the mistakes of the past. Hopefully we can correct them in the future. In my more modest way, I've tried to do this by preserving documents or fixing buildings. And the reason it's important is because right now we are in a situation in our country where people don't really know very much about American history or civics. It used to be the case that 7 to 8% of college students majored in history. Now that number is 2%. And the reason it's so low is that parents have become convinced that if their children don't major in a STEM subject, they won't be able to get a job at Goldman Sachs or something like that, sadly. And it turns out that the people who actually major in history sometimes wind up to being the head of Goldman Sachs. But it's a sad situation that now we downplay American history. And in fact, you can graduate from any college in this country without having to take an American history course. And you can be a major in history in most colleges and still not take an American history course. So we're kind of in a situation where we don't really know as much about the past as we should. Very often now in Chinese schools in China, Chinese school children are learning more about American history than we are teaching our own children. And I think what you've tried to do to kind of educate people is a great step forward, and there's a lot more we can do. And so I hope all of you will just think about what more you might be able to do to learn more about American history, but get your children and grandchildren to get interested in this subject, because if Jefferson said, and you've done a documentary on Jefferson, democracy is dependent on an informed citizenry. A really good representative democracy dependent on informed citizenry. Our citizenry is not that informed right now. I'll give you one statistic before I ask you one final question. So anybody here a naturalized American? Anybody? Naturalized, okay. To be a naturalized American, you have to take a citizenship test after 5 years of residency. In the early days of our country, in the Revolutionary War era, you just showed up, you didn't have passports or no visas. But in 1925, in the law, we basically changed things, and eventually we evolved it into a citizenship test. 100 potential questions. They give you the 100 potential questions to study, and then you get 10, and you have to pass 6 out of the 10. If you're 65 or older, they tell you exactly which 10 you're going to get to make sure that 65-year-old people, I guess they think they can't remember things as well. I don't know. But so 91% of the people that take that test pass. So people born elsewhere take this test, and 91% of the people pass this test regularly. The same test was in effect given to native-born Americans in all 50 states a couple years ago. 2.5 million people took the test. And only one state, Vermont, only one state, Vermont, did a majority of Americans pass that test, people born here, and in Vermont they barely passed it too, it was 53%. So our country isn't really learning as much about American history as we should learn, in my view, to be informed citizens and have an informed government. So are you concerned about this as well? I mean, you've been educating people now for roughly 50 years. Do you feel that we're making more progress, or you still think we're not doing as well as we should in educating our country about, and our younger citizens particularly, about American history?
I think it's a really dire situation right now. I think it's getting worse. And two things that you brought up, two important words, were Jefferson and citizenship. Jefferson says in the Declaration, all experience has shown that mankind are disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. He's basically saying that the entire history of the human race to this point has been people living under authoritarian rules, that evils are sufferable, right? That we have put up with this, and that we're really starting something new that's going to unleash new energies, but is going to require a kind of vigilance, that no longer will we be superstitious peasants or subjects, but we'll be this new thing, which are citizens. And what you see right now with this disinterest, the playing down of history for a variety of reasons in schools, and the way in which history is being used as a political football, so that somebody said in Florida that you could talk about Rosa Parks without mentioning race, that all of these things are the canary in the coal mine that are warning us of how incredibly perilous it is to not know what took place in our past. Because if you don't know where we've been, you can't possibly know where you are and where you're going.
So let me tell you one final anecdote about American history. I have a program where I interview in front of members of Congress, historians, and Ken, I did it with you. The theory is members of Congress should know a lot about history since they're making the laws. And so I try to have a dinner once a month that I host at the Library of Congress. Democrats and Republicans come. They try to get them to sit at the same table, and they like it because it's a nonpartisan event, and they actually get to talk to people from the opposite party, which they normally aren't allowed to do. And one time I thought it'd be nice if they understood how the judiciary system works. So I asked the Chief Justice if I could interview him there. And he said, okay. So I started the interview and said, Mr. Chief Justice, tell me, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States when you were a little boy? He said, no. Well, did you want to be a judge? No. Well, did you want to be a lawyer? No. Well, what did you want to be? I wanted to be an American historian. Why? I really loved American history, and that was all I really wanted to do. My father said, John, you'll starve to death as an American historian. Nobody will read your papers, and you won't have any money. How are you going to support a family as an American historian? John said, I don't care. This is all I want to do. So, okay, he went to Harvard, majored in American history. Coming back from college, from his home in Indianapolis in the junior year, he got off at the Logan Airport, got into a cab, and said to the cab driver, please take me to Cambridge. And the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in American history. And the cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So John went to law school. So Ken, I want to thank you for what you've done for America in educating people, and hopefully you have another 50 years to go to do this, okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.